1802, that was a good year. I didn't like it though. Really? Oh, it changed on me. Fine.
I was so excited about the Judiciary Act of 1802. Like, it was about time we reorganized the federal court system, right?
Right? Way overdue. I think we're good. I think it's recording. Should I stop it and then start another one? Okay. All right. Guys want to learn about routing? Yeah. All right. Let's talk about React Router. So first, maybe we should define what routing is. Can I have a volunteer to read this? Go for it, Pranav.
JavaScript package that allows our UI to stay in sync with our URL. It allows us to render specific components based on which routes match or don't match the current URL path.
Thank you. So yeah, it's just a JavaScript package that we can import into our projects that allow our UI to stay in sync with our URL. Now by URL, I mean the actual URL in the bar at the top, right? So pretty much everything we've done so far has been just at the root level. So either like localhost 3000 or when we push to GitHub pages, at github.io. But you think about like the average website you go to. Usually there's a home page, so at like mywebsite.com, that's like a home page or a welcome page or something. But then there'll be links to other things, right? So say there's a link that goes to mywebsite.com/users. What would you expect to see on that page? Users. Yeah, it's probably a list of users. Yeah, so it says something both to the person who is looking at the URL, what kind of information they would expect. It's also information that your web application can get out of the URL to do certain things based on what's in there, because there can be things like search parameters, query parameters, all sorts of information contained in that URL as well. Now in a typical website, when you change the location, that's actually making another request to the server and it's serving up an entirely different HTML page to you. But for JavaScript single page applications like what we're doing, we're always staying on a single page and we try not to reload that page ever really. We can just stay loaded. It gives a much more responsive user experience. But we may still want to have the ability to do other URL paths for a variety of reasons. So we need a way to kind of simulate that, but not actually, go to a different page and request an entirely different HTML page. So that's what React Router does, is it kind of simulates that whole thing where we can use different URLs and do different things with them, render different components based on what the URL is, without actually navigating to a different place. So one thing I do want to make clear is that there are several routing options for React. This is just probably by far the most popular. It's not actually made by the Facebook team that makes React. It is a completely independent thing. But yeah, it's definitely the most popular one, so that's what we're going to learn. So how do we get started with that? Step 1, install it in your project. So if you're using Yarn, just yarn add React Router DOM or npm install. Now there are a few different packages depending on what type of React project you have. So everything we've done and will do in this class is like web applications. You can also do React Native for native like mobile development, iOS and Android. That would have a different type of router for that. But for us, we're just going to be using React Router DOM. Yeah.
Which directory should we run that in?
So this is in whatever your project directory is. So you don't need to do it right now.
Okay.
It was just purely for example. Yeah. I mean, we will do this soon, but for an actual project. We're just talking about theoretically, how do you use the router in your project? So once we got it downloaded, the next step is, everybody remember the React DOM.render method? We talked about it when we first started React. It's the one JavaScript call in that index.js file that attaches our app to the actual index.html. So in the original version, it was just react-dom.render. The first argument was just our app, and then we were attaching that to the div with the ID of root. There's a lot of different ways you can get router into your application. This is, I think, by far the easiest and covers 90% of the use cases. Just wrap your app in a router. So after you've got it in your project and import it into the file, just put your app inside one. And that means your whole app is now inside of this router component. So once we have our app in a router, meaning we can use all the fancy router stuff, how do we actually define routes? Not too difficult. So there's an actual route component. And the first thing you give it is the path. So when you match this URL, then what do you render? Render whatever component I put in there. So if the path is /widgets, then I have a widgets component that I made. And so I just say, if my path matches that, then go ahead and render this component. So that's probably like the most simple version. As you can see, the second one is a little more complicated, but not too much. There's a couple extra things in there. The first one is the word exact. So that's just another prop we're passing to that component. And the reason you might want to do that is, so let's say I have the URL mywebsite.com/widgets. That's going to match the first one, right? I could also have /widgets and then put a bunch of gibberish after that. I could do /widgets/123/partytime. And that's still going to match the first one because /widgets is still part of that. If I only want it to match when it's an exact match, so exactly that, you can do what we're doing in the second one, which is put the word exact in there, meaning the second one is only going to match when it's exactly /stuff. So I can't put anything after that or it won't match anymore, and then it won't render the component. Now the other thing that's different about this, you'll notice, is we're not saying component specifically. You can also do an inline render, kind of like a stateless functional component. So we can just pass it a function that returns some JSX. So when, for the second route, when we match the URL path of /stuff, then we're just going to render an H1 that says stuff in it. Any question about any of that? Good. It's pretty straightforward. You just tell it what you want it to match and then what to do when it does match. Next question is, how do we actually get to those routes? So on a normal website, you would have like the A tags, right? You just click on, it takes you to a different place. In React Router, you have links and nav links. And pretty simple to use. Use them a lot like A tags. You just put the link in there. In between, you can put text of whatever you want for that link to say. And then you just tell it where you want it to go to. So kind of like the href in an A tag. The difference between links and nav links is that nav links also keep track of when they are the active path. So if I clicked on that nav link on the bottom, that would change my URL to /party. And then on that link that was rendered, it would know now that the URL matches that nav link path, and it would put a class of active on that rendered link. Now, it doesn't necessarily do anything by default, but for example, if I wanted to style that differently to show that this is now the active link, I could do that. There's a variety of things you could do with that. But that's the difference between links and nav links, is nav links know when they are the active link, and then put that class of active on the rendered component. Yeah?
Can we go from one website and back to a certain, maybe like back a photo, like back to a certain, going back a level up, something like that?
Yeah. So there's a variety of ways to do that. You could have a link that just goes to a shorter URL. So you could have a link that just goes to / for like the home page. There's also ways to navigate programmatically. We'll get to that in a minute. Because so far we've just dealt with routes and links, but there's other objects that are passed as props by the router that we can use to manipulate where we're at in terms of location. So another thing that we can use is the params. So in this particular component, you can see we've got a link that goes to /about/Bob and says about Bob. And then we have a route, which matches /about and then this weird colon thing name. Has anybody seen anything like that before? So that's what's known as a URL param. Basically, it's just a named parameter to the URL. So it's just saying if we match anything that is /about and then /something else, we're just going to assign that something else to a param called name. So when we do that, when we match that sort of path, then we'll render the user about component. And the user about component receives props. And those props, since we're inside the router automatically gives 3 objects as props to everything that's inside the router. So there is the match object, there's the history object, and then there's the location object. And they basically do what they sound like. We'll take a look at what they actually are when we start making a project. But the match object just gives you different information about the match that got you to that particular route. The location gives you information about the location you're in. And history is like, you got the back and forward button on your browser. So your browser normally keeps track of, what websites you've been to, like what the URLs are for those. So again, we're in a single page application, so we're not actually navigating. So the browser can't keep track of that for you. So the router itself does and gives you a history object that keeps track of all the different routes that you've been to within your particular React application. So in this particular case, when we match that path, so we click on the link that changes our URL to /about/Bob. That second part, so that matches then the path of /about, and then Bob gets assigned to the param name. The match object gets passed in through props, and then we can render this as a page about props.match.params.name. Params.name matches the param that we matched on for the route, and so Bob gets put in here. Does that kind of make sense? More or less? All right. So match is one object we get through props. History is another. So it just keeps track of your navigation over time. And it lets us navigate without using links. So obviously if a user has a link to something, they can click on it and go to that particular URL. But what if we want to manipulate it? So in response to certain user actions or server responses, things like that, we may want to push them to a particular page. You know how sometimes when you log into a page, you get redirected or whatever. So we may want to do something like that. So the history object not only has information about where we've been, but it also gives us methods so we can manipulate that. So for instance, push method on history. So if we do props.history.push, then we can give it a string of the URL we want to go to. So we can push somebody to a particular URL. Go back does what it sounds like. It just goes back one step, same as clicking the back button in your browser. Go forward is like the forward button. There's also go, where you can just pass it an integer. So like a positive integer would be going forward a certain number of steps. A negative integer would be going backwards a certain number of steps. So if you just want to go forward or back just one step, then probably use those, go back and go forward. But if you want to go multiple steps, then you can use the go method. And you can also block. So if there are certain conditions taking place, you can decide that, hey, I don't want the user to be allowed to navigate right now, so you can block navigation to certain things based on some conditions. So any questions about any of that? So yeah, just a quick recap. Put React Router in your project. Wrap your whole app in a router. So put your app just inside between the router opening and closing tags. Once you have the router basically encompassing your whole app, that means every component in your whole app gets passed props of match, history, and location. And then you can define route components that match on certain things. And when they match, you can have them say, when you match this, then render this component. And then you can use things like the history to navigate programmatically from one route to another. So that's basics of router. There's a lot it can do. Has anybody used any framework like Angular or Rails or Django? Familiar with routing in those applications? So for those of you who haven't used those before, you'll probably have an easier time with this because routing with React Router version 4 is very, very different. Those types of routers use what we call static routing, where basically you just have a routes file that's just a list of all the routes, like when you match this, render this thing. When you match this, render this thing. And those are all defined basically when the application spins up, and those don't change at all. And generally, you can only ever match one at a time. So React Router version 4 is very, very different. You can have routes all over the place. You just use them as components. So it's what they call dynamic routing. You just you can put a route component in wherever you want. You could put 5 of the same route in, but have them render different components. So you could match one thing and have 5 different things render. It's a little bit weird to get your head around if you're used to the other kind. But if you've not learned that, then you don't have to worry about overcoming that. I had a lot of trouble with that in first because I had a fair amount of experience with several static routing models, and it was kind of weird to get used to the dynamic routing thing. So that's the basics of React Router. Let's talk a little bit about second topic, so unrelated to React Router, which is fetch. So fetch is, I'll just read this. Fetch API provides a JavaScript interface for accessing and manipulating parts of the HTTP pipeline, such as requests and responses. It provides a global fetch method that provides an easy, logical way to fetch resources asynchronously across the network. So basically, you can use the fetch method to request information from a remote server. So I know some of you have done in your more advanced homework, some of you have already done some API requests. Does everybody know what I mean when I say like request data from an API? So I just mean there's a server somewhere else. So we've got our local server that's running our React application, but we may not have all the information we need here. I may want to get information from some other server somewhere, like a service, like GitHub, for instance. You know, you can get information about a GitHub user by making a request to the GitHub server. So you can use the fetch method and tell it what URL you want to fetch from, and it will go make that request for you. So for instance, let's say I set up a server. So the fetch method, again, it's globally available. You don't have to do anything or import anything to access it. It's just part of the newer versions of JavaScript. So let's say I have a server running at this URL. So I can just make that request. And that happens asynchronously. I know we've kind of talked about that a little bit a couple times. We'll spend a little bit more time talking about it again just for clarity. So when we make a request from a remote server, why do we want it to be asynchronous versus synchronous? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's even if it responds quickly, it's still a long time in computer terms, right? If we're running synchronously, we have to wait for that response from the server before we can do anything else, which is not generally the best idea for a good user experience. It means the user cannot do anything while we wait for that. You can kind of think of it like, let's say I have a question I need to ask Jaden. So I call her on the phone. And I'm like, hey, Jaden, I need this information. And she's like, cool, I filed that away somewhere. I'm going to go get it. And then I just have to stay on the line until she goes and finds it and comes back and tells me. So that would be synchronous. I can't do anything else. I can't call anybody else. Forget about call waiting or three-way calling. But imagine it's like an old school land phone line. I can't do anything else until she comes back and gives me that information. But if we do it asynchronously, and I call Jaden, I'm like, hey, Jaden, I need this information. And she's like, cool, not sure where it is. I promise I'll call you back when I get it. I'm like, awesome. So we hang up. I can go do other stuff. And then she just calls me back when she has it. So that's kind of like the difference between synchronous and asynchronous. So if I make an asynchronous request to a server, and the server's like, cool, I'll find that. I promise I'll get back to you when I find it. I'm like, awesome. So the fetch method makes a request to a server, and that returns a promise. Like it's literally called a promise, basically saying, I promise I will give you this information when I find it. And then you can do stuff with that response that you get back. So assuming that our response was in a JSON format, you can take that response, and call .json on it. Again, that's a globally available thing. You don't have to import that. And then you can do .then again. So just as soon as you finish that operation, then you've parsed it into a user object, and you can console log that. One other part of the promise chain that we've not really talked about yet is the catch. So you can have a lot of .thens. It's just each one, the output of the previous .then goes as the input of the next one. And you can chain as many of those as you want, as long as you have stuff to do. But if any of them have an error, then you can have a .catch, and it'll automatically go to that .catch and tell you what the error is, so then you can do whatever you need to do to handle that error. Make sense? Cool. So, any questions about routers, the React router, or the fetch method? Yeah.
So basically, what specific instance would you call the fetch method within the router?
So again, those are separate. We're going to use both in the project we're going to do, which is why we went over both. But they're not directly related. So you could have a project that uses router but has no need to talk to any outside APIs, and that's perfectly fine. The fetch method is a separate thing. It's just if I need to talk to an outside server, make a request for information from it, then I'm going to use the fetch method to do that. Any other questions? Cool. So real quick, well, no, we'll do that. Let's take our break now that we got through that, and come back in 10 minutes, and I'll show you what we're going to build with this lovely new knowledge.